Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday, the 22nd day of May in the year 2017, and we are live. I believe we are live. I hope we can stay that way. We've been having some Skype difficulties in recent days, which is part of the reason why we weren't able to deliver last week. We had to delete and then reinstall Skype in order to get the necessary updates. We have it on a different computer, and we had a little bit of trouble even connecting today. So, obviously the biggest problem is not on the studio end, it's on my end. But I believe we are live, and I want you to know how very, very pleased I am to be back in touch, and I hope that we're going to be able to roll uninterrupted in terms of technical difficulties and such for the balance of our program today. I was going to say it's taxing my technological skills, but I think that's really where the contradiction is. I'm not in the, I don't have enough technological skills to be paying any taxes at all. But anyway, welcome to the Virtual Center. We are back with a live program after so very, very long. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I do invite you to participate in our program. I would love to hear from you. I would love to know that there are some folks out there who are hanging in there with us through all of this technical difficulties and through my exit for a number of weeks in order to teach a class on an emergency basis. Let me give you our phone number. The area code is 304, and the number is 663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would sure love to hear from you that way. My email address, as it always has been, that has not changed, is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, lowercase, all one word, no punctuation, at gmail.com. And I do remind you once again of our Facebook page. We have one devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook, facebook.com, and you get on the homepage, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings there, although I will acknowledge that I haven't put up a posting for several days since we haven't been on the air. I tried to do it last week when we made a stab trying to get Skype to work, and we couldn't do it. So we've reinstalled it. We've got it into a different computer. And I believe as of right now, we are on the air and everything seems to be working. So again, thank you. I appreciate your continued support for this program and for Bob Kincaid and his folks at the Head On Radio Network. I think, and we've said it many times before, but I think it becomes clearer and clearer as time goes on, that there has never been, it seems to me, a time when we need to hear challenging, critical, alternative voices and alternative points of view on issues of the day than we do now. I really do believe that our program and its devotion to the Constitution of the United States is becoming more and more critical as the days, weeks, and months go on. We are 4 months into a new administration, the Republican administration of Donald Trump. There has been a lot of controversy about it. A lot of controversy about the president himself, about his connections, about his finances. There even has been talk of late, as you know, about the word impeachment. There are those. I heard somebody make a call to a program yesterday. I was listening in the car, and I heard a call in on a call-in program, and somebody made the point and said that he would be very surprised if this administration made it for a full year. So that's how tenuous the circumstances are. And it seems to me now more than ever, we need voices like those that you hear on the Head On Radio Network. And I do appreciate your continued support for the Virtual Center as one of those voices. As many of you know, the president is currently on an 11-day trip. I apologize. I thought that was my phone. I thought it was related to the program, and it was not. So I do apologize for that. I've been on the iPhone with Bob trying to get Skype to work before. So when the iPhone rang, I assumed it was. I thought there may be something wrong with our contact, and I apologize for that. As I was saying, we know that the president is into the front end of an 11-day trip to several important places in the Middle East and in Europe itself. The overseas trip began. It's his first, President Trump's first. It began in Saudi Arabia. It is now in Israel. And then next it will go to Rome and an audience with the Pope at the Vatican. And then the president will head to a meeting in Belgium, I believe, a NATO meeting, followed by a G7 economic meeting before the president comes back to the United States. So I believe the total extent of the visit is something like 10 or 11 days. It's very interesting because the fact that the president has left the country now has pretty well shifted conversation and attention from the pertinent political issues that were lighting up the airwaves here within the nation for so long. The firing of Director Comey of the FBI, the fallout from that, and a number of other things. These things obviously are not done. They are not completed. They are not finished. They are not gone. But they have been interrupted in terms of attention because of the president's overseas trip. The president has claimed that his trip is primarily to try to bring together the religions of the world in a united effort to combat ISIS, and that seems to be the point of view that he has taken. Prior to leaving Saudi Arabia 2 days ago, President Trump delivered a speech to leaders of a number of Arab countries in the Middle East. And there was some question and some angst here in the country over what exactly the president might say. Because as we think back through the campaign, it's very obvious that the president has over the months made some pretty volatile comments about Islam, about Saudi Arabia itself, about ISIS, and a number of other hot spots around the world. So it was really, a matter of concern for a lot of people as to how the president was going to handle this speech. And the reaction to it, while it is somewhat mixed, I think could be expressed as a sigh of relief I read a very, very interesting conversation on this issue, on the president's speech, that was published in the New York Times, I believe yesterday, between two experts in the area. And they pointed out many of the things that the president might have said that he didn't, but also cautioned that there were many things the president could have said, and they were both thankful that the president didn't go in that direction. The president was very careful not to use the word to associate Islam with terrorism. That obviously was the concern. That's been a major concern through the last part of the Obama administration and well into this one. President Obama, as you know, made it very, very clear that our war against extremism was not a war against Islam. And during the campaign, President Trump was a little bit uncertain or unclear on that particular issue, so there was some concern. What I would like to do in our program, now that we're back together, again, for what I hope will be our regular format, what I would like to do is share with you a couple of things, a couple of issues that I've been kind of holding in reserve for our program and for the time when we would get back together here at the Virtual Center. I had a couple of what I think are pretty significant articles on the presidency of Donald Trump that I wanted to share with you some time ago, and obviously have been unable to do it until now. But I really do believe that they are significant enough that they do warrant some attention. These articles were published, printed about a week ago. I had them all last week as we were furiously trying to get back on the air, and we were not successful in doing that. But it seems to me that what makes these particular articles, at least in my mind, of interest and concern is the fact that they range all the way from the sublime to the ridiculous, as the expression goes. And I think what they do is reveal or reflect the range of perspectives toward the administration, toward the activities and the comments of the administration, towards the possibility and the potential of the administration, and indeed towards what might be the concerns and dangers associated with this particular administration. This was one of the more recent postings that I put on our Facebook page, and I'd like to share it with you because it's a little bit lighter than many of them, but I thought that I would share it. It refers specifically to an article by Gail Collins that appeared last weekend in the New York Times. And it was a reference that she made to the president's coming visit to the Vatican. And of course, as we know, that trip is going to be later this week. And Gail Collins made the point that that there's some concern, given the allegations and the charges coming out of the White House about former President Obama wiring or tapping into the phone system at Trump Tower and all the rest of it. Gail Collins raised the possibility or the question as to whether the president will wear a wire when he meets with the Pope. And obviously, she said, there's absolutely no question in her mind that when he comes out of the meeting with Pope Francis, he's going to assure us that the Pope had pretty much promised him canonization as a result. And basically, all of this is in reference to an article that appeared last weekend by Bret Stephens. And it's an effort to be extremely critical of the Trump administration, some of the activities and some of the comments that are going on. And I thought I would share it with you, because first of all, it's, I think, quite interesting and quite insightful. Bret Stephens, in his article, makes reference to a 1946 Alfred Hitchcock movie called Notorious. In that movie, Claude Rains, who was married in the movie to Ingrid Bergman, Claude Rains is a Nazi spy living in Latin America. And he marries Ingrid Bergman only to find out that Ingrid Bergman is a spy for the United States, is an American spy. And as a consequence that he has been outed, and he's will assassinate him as a result of his error. And in this Notorious, Claude Rains addresses the finds himself in with his mother. His mother is played by Leopold Constantine. And he basically shares with her his knowledge about his wife being an American spy and his certainty that as a result of such a mistake, the mother responds with a line that is quotable, a line that Bret Stephens uses in the title of this article about. She says to her son, Claude Rains, "We are protected by the enormity of your stupidity for a time." Unquote. Again, it's quotable. "We are protected by the enormity of your stupidity for a time." And then Bret Stephens, in his wonderful article in the New York Times, goes back and reviews many of the things that have occurred in the first several weeks of the new administration. And he raises the question as to whether indeed our nation, this republic, which is so threatened by many of the things that are happening as a result of this administration, his hope that our republic will be protected for a time by the stupidity of many of the things that are being done and said at the head of it. It's kind of an extreme position on what many of the people are saying about this administration, and I think it's very significant. One other thing that I wanted to share with you on this particular topic. I heard the results of a fairly substantial poll that was done. And of course, we know that President Trump is always saying and assuring us that he is being treated unfairly by the media, that no administration before his has ever been treated as unfairly by the media as he is being treated, or as his administration is being treated. And a recent survey, a poll came out, a study came out, which validates much of what President Trump said. That in reality, looking at the way the media has covered the Trump administration during the first several weeks of that administration, the results of this research suggest that media coverage of this administration has been weighed heavily against Donald Trump to the tune of 80-20, that 80% of the media coverage on the Trump administration has been negative, while only 20% of media coverage has been positive. And the results of this poll, the results of this research, it's not really a poll, seem to validate the assertions of President Trump. I can remember hearing the results of this. And the first thing that occurred to me, and I wanted to share it with you, the implication of this is that there's a choice. The implication of this is that media does not report the news, rather it comments on the news. And therefore, it's a choice as to whether the comments are positive or negative. It seems to me that if you look at the reporting of news in an ideal setting, it ought to be objective. Let me put this another way. If 80% of the treatment that this administration is getting is negative, likely it's based on the fact that the actions of this particular administration have been largely negative. And so I think that's a very, very important point, because the president is making the case, or seems to be making the case, that there's some sort of a concerted effort to attack, to focus on what he calls fake news. That the whole Russian thing he refers to as fake news. The implication is that there really is not news being reported at all. There's politics being played by the media. The fact of the matter is, we know that there's some of that. There always is, because of the nature of interpretation. If you want to hear coverage the other way, I would suggest that you listen for a time to Sean Hannity's coverage or treatment of the Trump campaign, and you'll get the other side of that same coin. We know that that goes on. But the fact of the matter is, the bulk of news, we have to believe, is based on what's happening. The news and how it's presented is reaction to what is happening. And I think all of us need to be very, very aware of that. Anyway, I posted this particular item on our Facebook page. I was very, very taken by Gail Collins's column in the Times when she made reference to the president meeting with the Pope and wearing a wire. I couldn't help but silently chuckle to myself. And then the idea of the promise of canonization, it seemed to me, kind of pointed to the extreme absurdities that we're beginning to detect very early on in this particular administration. The same day that I posted that particular piece on the Bret Stephens article and the reference to the Alfred Hitchcock movie Notorious, I posted another that was written by William Rivers Pitt and appeared in the publication truthout.org. If you go to truthout.org to Williams Rivers Pitt, you'll find that he's a regular contributor to that particular digital publication. And the fact of the matter is, it's quite a different picture of what the administration and what's happening. And the reason I posted on this one is because I wanted to establish on our Facebook page the contrast between the extremes. In fact, the way I said it in the posting, I said in an earlier posting today, I suggested, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that there's a serious note of levity, almost thigh-slapping comedy at times, in the antics of the current occupant at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But I didn't want to leave our Facebook page presenting the impression that what was happening in Washington was light and was leaning in the direction of comedy. That in fact, much of what's happening there is not humorous at all. And in fact, at times, and of course this is my own particular bias because of my commitment for the Constitution of the United States, it seems to me that we are lurking very, very close at times to constitutional crisis in this country. And that's the issue that Williams Rivers Pitt brings to his piece. And the title of his piece is related to President Nixon and Watergate. And the title is Trump Nixes Nixon, Where Watergate Goes to Die. And Williams Rivers Pitt argues that while many people are drawing the analogy, the comparison, if you will, between what's happening with the Trump administration and Watergate, Pitt makes the point that what is happening now is potentially much more serious and much more dangerous to the Republic than even Watergate. Nixon tells us, Nixon, according to Pitt, was the creature born of this earth, evil for sure, but constrained by the limits of excess that made his threat manageable. In other words, as dangerous and as bad as President Nixon was, as Watergate was, the fact of the matter is it was something that we could deal with, that we could understand, that we could relate to and deal with. Pitt writes, a leopard born without spots is still a leopard, and like a man is ultimately predictable and entirely mortal. That's his characterization of Richard Nixon. That as bad as Nixon turned out to be, he was within the range that all of us could deal with and understand. Even though he was a leopard born without spots, he functioned in ways which were predictable and entirely mortal. On the other hand, Pitt tells us, Donald Trump is a creature unlike any that we've ever encountered before. Pitt says, and this is a quote, he has annihilated his own political career 1,000 times over already, and yet he surges on, doomed and implacable, like Coleridge's painted ship upon a painted ocean, unquote. The message, it seems to me, is that despite the obvious similarities between Nixon and Watergate on the one hand, and the early days of the Trump administration on the other, the fact of the matter is there's a serious difference. And that difference is we never got to the point where we couldn't understand or figure out or deal with what President Nixon was doing. But the fact of the matter is, President Trump is saying and doing things which we as a nation have never had to confront before. Pitt warns us, quote, his doom is our own. Not only is the FBI director gone, but all the U.S. attorneys are gone. The Attorney General is Jeff Sessions, who will gleefully rubber stamp every contra-constitutional edict that slithers from President Trump's mouth. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is a Trump man. House Speaker Paul Ryan is a Trump man. Unquote. At the time, of course, last weekend, the debate was raging about the call for a special counsel or a special prosecutor to investigate the Russian issue, the potential connection between the Russians and our 2016 election, and whether, in fact, members of the Trump administration were colluding with the Russians in order to have an effect on last fall's elections. And of course, that's what Comey was doing when President Trump dismissed him. So last weekend, when Pitt wrote this article, the debate was raging about the need for a special counsel. And you may recall that in the height of that, Mitch McConnell called a news conference, his weekly news conference, and responded to those who were demanding a new investigation, a special counsel. And McConnell said on the floor of the Senate, "Today we'll no doubt hear calls for a new investigation, which can only serve to impede the current work being done." Unquote. In other words, what Mitch McConnell was saying, in effect, was that he didn't believe that that the situation warranted a special investigation. Not only that, but he believed that the effort to appoint a special counsel or an independent counsel would undermine the House and Senate committees already engaged in such an investigation. Well, the fact of the matter is, we know that the Assistant Attorney General Rothstein issued the call this past week for the special counsel and its former FBI Director Mueller. And so we have a special investigation going on into the Russian influence in the election. And it's at that point, of course, that President Trump began his overseas tour. In reality, the combination of his going overseas plus the appointment of the special counsel, it seems to me, has taken media attention off that particular issue for a while. It's obviously not done. It's not finished. But there's no question that now that it's in the hands of a special prosecutor or a special counsel, chances are that the daily revelations that have been coming out will cease. At that time, Pitt warned that we really didn't have that much of a chance to have a special counsel appointed until someone in a position of authority decided that it had to be done. And obviously, the Assistant Attorney General, the one who wrote the memo that President Trump initially used as a justification for the dismissal of Director Comey, stepped forward and made that call. But I wanted to share with you, and especially to contrast with the levity and the lightness of the Gail Collins piece and the Bret Stephens reflection on the Alfred Hitchcock movie from 1946, Notorious, about the incredible extent of your stupidity will keep us safe temporarily. Pitt argues that at the time of Watergate, a hero in a Superman suit with a red cape came forward in the person of Archibald Cox. But it was beginning to look like, indeed it does look like, there aren't any Archibald Coxes that are liable to step forward and pull our irons out of the fire in this one. And Pitt draws a conclusion about President Trump and the threat to the Constitution and the threat to the Republic that seems to be in the air with this administration. And I wanted to read this particular paragraph from the Williams Rivers Pitt article on truthout.org. Quote, "The federal government has been pruned of its independent prosecutorial powers by a president who duped everyone into thinking he's merely some rampaging buffoon with a Twitter fetish. The few remaining options are controlled by Trump hatchet men who have little use for concepts like justice and the rule of law. Trump the fool? Don't believe it for a second. The man makes Richard Nixon look like some silly ham-fisted alderman by comparison. When he finally gets bored of seeing himself on television and decides to stomp the clutch, the only things in his way will be the bug corpses accumulating on his windshield." The implication is that many of the checks, many of the barriers, much of the safety net that had been created and were in place in order to protect us, protect the Republic from a constitutional threat, the likes of Watergate, have been dismantled or are in effect not operable at the moment. As he said in the quote I read earlier, Mitch McConnell's a Trump man. Paul Ryan's a Trump man. The Attorney General is Jeff Sessions, who has his own track record when it comes to a commitment to the rule of law. The U.S. attorneys are all gone. Now the FBI director is gone, and new interviews are ongoing for a replacement. Pitt argues that all the preliminary actions have been taken. And when this president decides that it's time, he's liable to kick this thing into high gear. And William Rivers Pitt does not see an Archibald Cox in the wings waiting to step in and take over and save the day. Again, I think this is an extreme example of how far opposite this situation is from much of the levity that seems to be associated with reporting on the comments and the activities coming out of the White House during this period. We have one person that's making jokes about wearing a wire to meet with the Pope. And then we have this other article on the very same situation, which basically makes the case that the Constitution itself is in jeopardy. Fact of the matter is, this morning, as I was doing some reading online, I listened again to President Trump's address in Saudi Arabia yesterday. And one of the things I noted that right behind him was sitting his daughter and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner and Ivanka. And it dawned on me as I was thinking about the Rivers Pitt article, the William Rivers Pitt article, that many of the issues that the media has been raising, beginning with the president's refusal to release his tax returns, or his refusal to totally separate himself from his business interest, his business ventures, and some of the examples that we've seen of members of his family actually using his presidency as a lever to promote business, their own business interests. For example, last week there was a story about another member of the Kushner family in China who was using the connection to the Trumps through Jared Kushner as a way to attract major contributors to the building of an apartment complex in New Jersey for a $500 million investment, I believe. $500,000 investment in this particular real estate venture. Chinese investors were being offered green cards, citizenship. This at a time when the administration and the forces of the Immigration Service are rounding up people in this country who have not legally acquired citizenship. At the same time, the administration is pursuing policies which make citizenship look so important and so significant. At that very time, members of the Kushner family, I believe Jared Kushner's sister, is in China using the connection with the Trumps, the connection with the White House, as a way to promote their own personal business. Many of these things have been raised over and over again in recent weeks. But the fact of the matter is, nothing has happened. And watching the president's daughter and son-in-law sitting behind him during this major speech in Saudi Arabia, followed this morning by coverage of the president's visit to the holy places in Israel, with Jared Kushner and Ivanka there as well, makes it clear that many of the issues and many of the concerns that have been raised in recent weeks have not resulted in any changes or anything significant happening. In other words, the president plunges on. And while many people, media people, begin to say, this is the issue that's going to bring his administration to a halt. This is the issue that's going to matter. The president has gone too far this time, or that time, or whatever. The fact of the matter is, the president is successfully weathering all of this negative publicity. And he's continuing to move forward. And it's very obvious to me that we are now, today, 2 days beyond 4 months, January, February, March, 4 months into this administration. It's very obvious that the opposition is getting tired, that the issues being raised are having no material impact. The leaders of the Republican Party, which control all facets of the federal government, remain Trump men, refuse to take action. it's very obvious to me that if the Republican leadership is unwilling to take a stand in opposition to many of the things that the president is doing, then it's likely that while it keeps the media buzzing and keeps the talk shows talking, the fact of the matter is nothing material is really happening as a result of these concerns. And I would suggest to you that that particular idea or that particular perspective seems to me to validate the concerns of William Rivers Pitt. It bothers me immensely that the administration's seeming willingness to do things and try things and take actions or positions which I never thought possible, which I never thought the American people would put up with, are indeed working. And I think this is something that all of us need to be concerned about. What I'd like to do, and I'd like to spend the better part of our program in our second hour today on this particular issue, but we're moving toward the conclusion of our first hour. It's about, I believe it's about 10 minutes before the hour. So we've got about 10 minutes before we're going to pause and take our break, and then we'll get into our second hour. Last week when we temporarily went on the air until Skype went down on us, I wanted to share with you, Virtual Center, some of the things that occurred and instances I've had over the last doing live programs here at the Virtual Center. And I know that I went through a little bit of this background before, but I really don't know how much of it got on the air. A live broadcast of our local universities, West Virginia Tech, Institute of Technology, who teaches history, asking if I could come in and pinch hit and take over. I inherited 4 classes, enrolling a total of 200 students, about 176, I believe, in the 4 classes. 2 of them had 50 students. One of them had 44, I believe, and the other one had 32 or 33, something like that. And so with the preparation involved and trying to take over someone else's classes in midstream, there was no way that I felt that I could continue to put together programs here at the Virtual Center. So in order to substitute for this particular emergency, I talked to Bob Kincaid and told him that I really thought that we would just have to rely on previous programs for a while until this particular situation was completed. And I did that. And 2 of the classes were in contemporary United States history, which I was very comfortable with because I had taught that numerous times over the years. But 2 of the classes were history of technology classes. And as I told the dean, I didn't even know there was such an animal. And he pointed out that West Virginia Institute of Technology is one of the few places that offers this particular class, since its major program, its flagship program, is engineering. And many of the students who come to tech wanting to go into engineering or into the sciences would be very interested in an early class in their first or second year in a history of technology. So they've been offering that class. And the faculty member that I replaced was really a specialist in that particular area. And in doing my own research, I found that this history of technology class was not just a focus on technology, but in effect, the textbook was written by 2 specialists in history of science. And so what this was a history of science in the West, for the most part. along with some contrasts with the East. Anyway, I took on the challenge, and I believe it was successful. I think I did a good job. I hope the students would agree. But what makes me think that it was overall a successful experience was the fact that I learned so much, not only from my reading, but from the students themselves. And the fact that there was so much in the air to be learned made me believe that likely it was a positive experience for most of the people involved, not just me, but also the students. And I've kind of relied on that finding. The fact of the matter is, I spent 5 weeks doing some pretty intensive reading in history of science and technology. And I had to, first of all, find out, and I did this by going back and reading the textbook itself, getting some idea as to what these students had already covered, what they already had, where the class had come from, and what had been covered up to the point that the instructor became ill. And then I had to make a determination as to how I would top off that learning experience in the last 3.5 weeks of the semester. It was actually close to 5 week. It was 4.5 week experience. But the last week was final exam week. There were no classes. Right. The final exam I gave almost had to be a take-home. It almost had to be an effort to try to bring out from students what they had learned in the class, what they had come to know as a result of this class that they didn't know before, especially since so many of them planned on moving into the fields of science and technology. So I decided that I needed to have the final exam ready to go well before the class ended. I couldn't wait until the class was over before I gave a final exam. And so what I did very early in the experience was to put together a final exam and give it to the students 2 weeks before the semester ended. So that in reality, these students had the last 2 weeks of the semester to pull together what they had learned in the class, as well as how they would react from what they already learned to some of the material that I was covering in class. As I hear myself say this, I'm becoming even more appreciative of the challenge. And I keep thinking to myself, as it's been over now for a couple of weeks, but as I think back on it, I keep saying to myself, I really can't believe I did that. I can't believe, because as I look at it now, hindsight's 20/20, of course, the challenge was huge. And if I had really appreciated the immensity of it, maybe I wouldn't have tried to do it. But the fact of the matter is, I rolled up my sleeves and I did it, and I believe it came out very well. In talking to our own Bob Kincaid about this particular situation, I told Bob what I had in mind. I really, obviously, as many of you will appreciate and already know, I have tremendous respect. I've learned to have tremendous respect over the years for Bob's insights and his intelligence. And I believed that if I laid the situation before him, I could probably get some pretty good advice. And so basically, after I explained the situation and what I thought I would do, then I asked Bob the magic question. What should I ask? I mean, I just can't put together a final exam at the university level on a course in the history of technology and just say something simple like, what did you learn in this class? Or tell me what you learned that you didn't know before. I'm thinking of Chris Matthews, who ends his program every night with a panel discussion in which he asks all the panelists, tell me something that I don't know. So basically, that was my final exam. Bob's suggestion was, he's the one that gave me the question. Bob's suggestion is, why don't you just ask them, now that they've taken this class, what they feel the purpose of the purpose of technology is all about. What is the purpose of human technology? And so the question that I came up with is this one. What is the purpose of human technology? Was it always as you define it, or did it change over time? If so, why? That's the question. And as I told them, in your answer, please make a serious effort to address that question as it evolved over time. Your essay need not be a nuts and bolts list of information, things you learned, but it should reflect the kind of careful thought and due consideration that would create an opportunity to bring together the content of the course, as well as looking at some of the more interpretive questions that I raised at the end of the course. Without getting into the content of the course, I would tell you that the course pretty much ended around the theory of relativity as introduced by Albert Einstein. In the early 20th century. And so basically what we are facing in today's world is a world which has become so fixed, so fixated on technology that there are some people who believe that technology has become such an integral part of our way of life in the 20th and 21st century. Some people believe that technology has ceased to be at the service of man and has come to be a controller of man. To put that in another way, some people are concerned that technology has become so important to us and to our way of life that it literally controls us. That's the question or the issue that I spent the last 3 weeks of the semester on. Was indeed, did there come a point when our way of life became so committed to technology that technology itself became the driver rather than the passenger in this particular trip that we're on toward a new future? That's the issue that I'd like to spend our second hour on. I know I've gone a couple of minutes over the top of the hour. But I'd like to pause there and ask you to think about that. Think about the issues related to technology in the modern world and whether, in fact, you believe that technology remains at the service of mankind, or whether technology has become so significant in our society, in our way of life, that it literally dictates what we do and how we do it. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's 4 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. Then we'll come right back and we'll spend the balance of our program on this issue. Thank you very much. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour, abbreviated though it is. It's currently 10 minutes after the hour, and that leaves us a pretty good portion of time to get into some of this issue of these issues of technology. It's one of those situations where I was in a situation where I really had no choice except to pursue this particular topic. But the fact of the matter is, as I pursued it, I learned so much from it and began to appreciate the importance of it. And one of the things I told myself as I was actually living this experience was that there were lessons coming to the fore that I really believed would be valuable to discuss here at the Virtual Center. I made up my mind early on that this stuff was so important that it's material and information that we should deal with. Over the months and years that we've been on the air, we've touched on a number of these issues. But in this particular situation, it all seemed to come together, and at least in my mind, became extremely significant. I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the issues of the day, materials we covered during our first hour, or indeed your thoughts on some of these issues related to technology in the modern world. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate one-on-one with me that way, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, I do encourage you to visit our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in the search box at the top, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you'll have access to some of the postings that I've put on there, the most recent ones coming first. As we complete this material on technology on the air, I plan to go to Facebook and do something with it there, because I'd like to get a written record of much of this, because I do believe that it's quite significant. One of the things that I neglected to do, and let me right that wrong right now, is to make you aware of the textbook we used. It's a paperback. It's the second edition of a book entitled Science and Technology in World History, an Introduction. So this is not into science, but again, it's an introduction to the flow of the issues related to technology and science throughout the recorded history of the world. The authors of the book are James McClellan and Harold Dorn. Both of them are history of science professors. The reason I share the name of the book is because I want to share with you a couple of the comments that are on the cover, on the facing of the book. Most of you know, we've talked about this before, that when you publish a book, you naturally need to sell the book. And so most authors will try to get very very positive comments from people who have reviewed and read the book. I wanted to share with you a few of these reviews and comments on this particular textbook, because when I read them, and I read them before I actually got into the book itself, I began to appreciate the significance of the course, the significance of this experience, just by what some of these reviews said. For example, listen to this one. This particular review appeared in the Canadian Journal of History. If I could attach bells and whistles and flashing lights to this review, I would do so, because McClellan and Dorn's book deserves to be brought to the attention of all professional historians, and indeed the general reading public, by any means necessary, unquote. That's pretty powerful. That this book, according to this particular review, is so significant and needs to be read by everybody in order to appreciate and understand the subject at hand. McClellan is a professor in history of science, and Harold Dorn is professor emeritus of the history of science and technology at Stevens Institute of Technology. Basically, one of the findings or the themes of this particular textbook is to make the distinction between science and technology. And the fact that what becomes clear in the reading of this history is that technology has always influenced science, not the other way around. In fact, it's not until we get to the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century and the reactions to it in the early 20th century that science actually begins to infect technology. But technology's been there all along. But as we know, we didn't experience in the West what we call the scientific revolution until well into the history of the Western world. The history of science and the scientific revolution itself doesn't really become a factor in Western history until the 16th and 17th centuries. And most of us assign the scientific revolution as much as anything else to the worldview associated with Isaac Newton's principles of the modern world, the so-called Principia. And Newton's discovery and development of the issues related to motion, the laws of motion, if you will, gravity, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, science itself doesn't begin to impact technology until somewhat recently. I think that's one of the findings, one of the things that I didn't appreciate going in. But let me share something else I learned in this class. And that is that what we know about science and technology, for the most part, is pretty much associated with Western civilization. That what happened in the non-Western world has pretty much been left in the background and not been emphasized. But the fact of the matter is, some of the biggest breakthroughs in the areas of history of technology came in the Far East. And one of the issues that become very significant, and I'm really trying to pull all of this together here in one fell swoop, because I don't want to get into the substance of the course itself that much, because that would be pretty deadly. But one of the things that becomes very clear early on is that in the West, there is a clear distinction made very early between the material world and the spiritual world. Between philosophy, if you will, and what later we know as science. But one of the factors that becomes very significant, and is becoming very significant of late, is that particular distinction which occurs in the West between the separation or the division between the world of matter, the material world, and the spiritual world, doesn't happen in the Eastern worldview. The Eastern worldview remains holistic. The Eastern worldview basically suggests that the relationship between the material world and the spiritual world is a close and vital one, and ought never to become separated. But in the West, it does. I knew that going into this course experience. What I didn't know was that going all the way back to the Greeks, to the classical period, the early Greeks looked at the world very much the way the Eastern worldview views it. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Greek thinkers were basically arguing for the totality and at the writings of Heraclitus, Heraclitus, in what is called the Milesian school of Ionia in Greece. In the early Greek language, the word for physics was physis, the endeavor of seeing the essential nature of all things, a separation between the material world and the spiritual world. But that the study of physics itself was an effort to understand the interrelationships which explained the essential nature of all things. The Milesians, as it were known as hylozoists, those who think matter is alive, those who think that there is no such thing as solid matter, but that the fact matter is comprised of moving parts, of motion. And this is Heraclitus. Heraclitus believed in a world of perpetual change, in what he called a world of eternal becoming. For him, all changes in the world are part of a dynamic and cyclical interplay of opposites. He believed that any pair of opposites is in fact connected or related, is a unity. And he called this unity the Logos, Logos. But gradually, the recognition of differences between the spiritual world and the world of matter, material world, began to surface. And they surface in large part in the writings and thinking of Aristotle. Aristotle recognized the difference between the material world and the spiritual world. Aristotle became the West's way of looking at the world for 2 centuries, for several centuries, not 2 centuries, 2,000 years. Aristotle believed that the world of the spirit, questions related to the human soul and contemplation of God's perfection, were more valuable than the investigations of the material world. Historians believe that one of the main reasons why Aristotle's thinking went unchallenged for so long was because Aristotle referenced or made mention of or recognized the reality of the 2 separate entity perspectives. He emphasized the spiritual. The West began to emphasize the material and began to recognize the division between the 2. The Eastern world never recognized or acknowledged that split. And the whole history of science from that point on was based on the reality or the fact, the assumption, that we could understand the material world, but we could never understand the spiritual world. And gradually the belief began to take shape that the only connection between the 2 worlds was that the spiritual world was inherited by what we came to call God. And eventually the perspective began to be accepted that God ruled the entire universe. We could know our world because we had reason and common sense, but we couldn't know God's world. In fact, in Matthew 20, we see the very famous expression, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Matthew is acknowledging the separation between the worlds of matter and worlds and matters of the spirit, issues related to the spirit. In the early period, with the fall of Rome, St. Augustus, published his work, The City of God. And in that publication, which actually consists of, I believe it's 22 volumes in this study, Augustus makes clear the distinction between the city of God and the earthly city of man. But what Augustus is able to do is linked the two into the worship of a God. And from this is the implication that God rules the entire universe from above. Man's reason gives him the ability to understand God's world, but not to understand God. In fact, with Christianity comes the idea that to try to understand God is heresy. It is an effort to reduce God to human terms. When in fact that can't be done. And so Christianity teaches that the only way to understand God is through faith. We can't know God except as we come to believe God and believe in God and believe in God's almighty power. And this really forms the basis of the development of Western civilization throughout. And it's 1,500 years in from the birth of Christ that the West experiences what we call the scientific revolution. Up until that point, the Western world pretty much subscribed to the worldview, to the universe, as explained by Aristotle. That there is the duality of the material world and the spiritual world. And that ultimately, man's ability to understand the church says, the Christian church, ultimately first the Catholic Church, and then many of the Protestant denominations that emerge from it, focus on the idea of faith. Faith in the Word of God. Ultimately, in a class like this, what becomes very clear to me as I read this and think about it, and as I look at the sources, one of the themes that becomes very clear to me through the development of Western civilization is the degree to which this worldview of a separation between the material world and the spiritual world becomes the basis of power. Throughout the world's history, we come to confront example after example of people who claim political power as a result of their communication with a world that nobody can understand, the world of the spirit, the world of God. China believes that God, the Chinese believe that God manages the universe, and that God's representative on earth is the emperor. That the emperor is must be all powerful, because the emperor is in fact the reflection of God himself, the Spirit of God. In the West, the Christian church teaches faith. And the Catholic Church teaches that the purpose of man's life on earth is to earn salvation and to be able to live forever and ever in the presence of God in heaven. And the Catholic Church teaches that it itself is God's creation in order to assist man in his efforts to earn salvation. That the church has special sacraments which gives those who receive the sacraments special graces which enhance the chances of them being saved and going to heaven. The idea being that because man is incapable of knowing God in reality, and I'm thinking of the famous scriptural story with Thomas, doubting Thomas, who refused to believe that the risen Christ was indeed Christ until he was able to put his fingers in his side where the wounds from the crucifixion existed. And Scripture tells us that Christ's response was, Thomas, you believe only because you can see. Blessed are those who believe without seeing. And so in reality, what we see is that the entire basis of Christian power in the world is based on the duality or the dualism between the world of the spirit and the material world. Christianity teaches that God exists in three different elements or essences. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. God the Father is the Almighty God that exists in heaven. God the Son is God who is Christ Jesus, who walked the face of the earth and came here to save men's souls. The Holy Spirit is a principle or an essence. In reality, the Jews forever focused on Yahweh, God the Father. Christians focused on Jesus, God the Son. The Eastern worldview continued to focus on God the Holy Spirit as a principle that united or connected all creation, all living things. And that really helps explain the distinction between the world of the West and the world of the East. And this went through well up through the 19th century, through the Industrial Revolution and into the 20th. But in the early 20th century, along came Albert Einstein. And one of the most fascinating things about Einstein's science is how close Einstein sees science to the Eastern worldview. Einstein tells us that all matter is energy. That the world, the material world, is a world of constant energy, of constant motion, of interrelationships between opposites. That in reality, what appear to be opposites together comprise a unity, which is very much what the early Greeks believed, which is very much what the Eastern worldview continued always to believe. Let me share with you if I can find it. Three quotations. Each of these quotations is from a noted physicist. More specifically, each of these quotations is from a physicist involved in the Manhattan Project, which is the development of the atomic bomb, the use of which ended World War II. Perhaps the most noted of the three is Robert Oppenheimer, Julius Robert Oppenheimer. Here's what Oppenheimer says about atomic energy. The general notions about human understanding, he says, which are illustrated by discoveries in atomic physics, are not in the nature of things wholly unfamiliar, wholly unheard of, or new. Even in our own culture, they have a history. And in Buddhist and Hindu thought, a more considerable and central place. What we shall find is an exemplification, an encouragement, and a refinement of old wisdom, unquote. What Oppenheimer is alluding to is the extent to which the Eastern worldview is the world that nuclear physics and science in the 20th century is exposing to us. The second quote I'd like to share with you is Niels Bohr, who was a physicist on the Manhattan Project. Niels Bohr says, quote, "For a parallel to the lesson of atomic theory, we must turn to those kinds of epistemological problems with which already thinkers like the Buddha and Lao Tzu have been confronted when trying to harmonize our position as spectators and actors in the great drama of existence." And finally, Werner Heisenberg, yet another physicist. The great scientific contribution in theoretical physics, he says, that has come from Japan since the last war may be an indication of a certain relationship between philosophical ideas in the tradition of the Far East and the philosophical substance of quantum theory, unquote. The foundations of 20th century physics and quantum theory and relativity force us to see the world very much the way the Hindus, Buddhists, and Taoists saw it. And the similarity between the two worldviews is unmistakable. Einstein's theories and Einstein's science validate the principles of the Eastern worldview, the Hindu-Buddhist worldview, that all things are connected, that motion is constantly going on, that there are laws governing this motion, and that man can know them. let me share with you, if I can, the following. From the Upanishads. Many of you will recall or be familiar with the Upanishads. Quote, "He who, dwelling in all things, yet is other than all things, whose body all things are, who controls all things from within, he is your soul, the inner controller, the immortal." The message is clear that the Creator, the Almighty, the soul, the immortal, is a principle or a spirit that dwells in all things, yet is other than all things, whose body all things are, who controls all things from within. That, says the Upanishads, is the meaning or the understanding of the world or the universe as God created it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, early 18th century philosopher, poet, scholar, wrote an essay entitled The Oversoul, in which he basically said essentially the same things that we see in the Upanishads. This is Emerson. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, much as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere. That unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. The common heart, of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. Overpowering reality, which confutes our tricks and our talents, and constrains everyone to pass for what he is, and to speak from his character and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand, and become virtue and wisdom and power and beauty. What Emerson is suggesting is that there is an essence, a principle, a common unity that unites all living things, which he calls the Oversoul. It is the existence of the Oversoul within us and within all living things, which gives us the ability to speak from our character rather than just from our tongue. To speak from our hearts, from the soul, and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. Emerson says, he doesn't say this way, but here in the West, he's saying by inference, we live in succession, in division, in parts and particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. This deep power in which we exist, and whose beatitude is all accessible to us, is not self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. That, I would suggest, is the Eastern worldview, and that is what Einstein has discovered. That is what modern science is telling us reality is that we are all connected. We are all part of a common essence. Emerson says, we see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree. But the whole, of which all of these are the shining parts, is the soul. Only by the vision of that wisdom can the horoscope of the ages be read. And by falling back on our better thoughts, by yielding to the spirit of prophecy, which is innate in every man, we can know what it saith. Every man's words, who speaks from that life, must sound vain to those who do not dwell in the same thought on their own part. I dare not speak for it. Basically, what he's saying is that once we discover this unity, once we discover the sense of oneness, which links all of us together, the world that God created will begin to make sense. Emerson believes that the purpose of life is to discover that reality or that truth. That's what life is about. That's what education is about. Everything else is artificial, is man-made, is insignificant, is secondary in importance, in spite of what we say about it. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution, man began to apply science to his world, to this material world. And it's at that point that technology, which had always been there, which had always been at the service of man, the same technology that made rock into a weapon, a hammer, or into the foundation of a home, that same technology that had always been at man's service in the 20th century of science, applied science, the application of technology to man's problems. Technology began the process, the driver rather than the server of mankind. And some people began to raise serious questions about technology and about the extent to which technology in reality had become its own confronting man. Technology gives man the foundation or the ability to better achieve and solve the challenges which stand before him in his life. But man always remains in control. Man always makes the decisions as to whether to employ a particular technology or whether not to. And many of these decisions are made according to morality and ethics, according to man's vision or man's concept of right and wrong. But once technology began to take over, once technology became more than a means to solving problems and became an end in itself, once man's understanding of the universe became a vehicle to man's takeover and power in that universe, then technology became its own outcome, its own end, its own goal. The mere fact that technology was there meant that it had to be used. And the classic example in the 20th century, I would suggest, is the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. There is absolutely no question, and we've talked about this decision before. We talked about the issues that went into the decision to drop the atomic bomb twice on two different Japanese cities. And whether, in fact, ending the war justified the dropping of the bomb. There is absolutely no question that into that decision was factored in the cost of the development of the bomb and the political realities of the world we lived in. There was no question a recognition on the part of President Truman and others that we had to have the bomb. In fact, Roosevelt's decision to develop the bomb, to initiate the Manhattan Project, was based on the reality that it appeared Germany was in the process of developing such a weapon. And in our own defense, we had to develop it. And that the resources necessary to that development were insignificant compared to the emergency. There's no question that once we had it, the decision to use it was impossible to avoid, especially when we were looking at the post-war struggle with international communism with a threat to our way of life. The assumption was that the political realities of the world we lived in dictated the technology we had needed to be used, and that the whole justification for the decision to drop the bomb became just that, a justification, a rationalization. A rationalization for a decision that raised serious ethical and moral questions. It was a decision that warranted its own positive response. And President Truman made it. It seems to me that what the atomic bomb decision indicates is that we had reached a point when technology had ceased to be at the service of man and began to control man's decision-making, began to dictate options and alternatives and choices to man. And the only way to rationalize or justify those decisions is to eliminate the moral or ethical questions from the equations totally. The conclusion? Technology, by its own definition, is its own morality, its own ethics, and can't be controlled by another. I'd like to pursue this in tomorrow's program if we could. We've reached the end of our program today. It is the top of the hour. I want to first of all, I want to thank Skype for hanging in there for the entire 2 hours. More importantly, I want to thank you for your continued support for the Head On Radio Network and for the Virtual Center. On behalf of both, this is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. Have a great day, and hopefully we'll be back together tomorrow. Thank you.